Ahoy, ballers! This is your Captain Ty, Hildenbrand, that fine gentleman over there. As always, the first mate, Dan Rubenstein. Look, it's the off season, Dan.
Yeah?
And we were thinking here this morning, why not now? Why not take another ride on the Twos Cruise in the middle of February on President's Day, sir? How are you?
Good. It's icy out here. I'm not going to lie. I'm glad I brought my college football scarf of choice. It's chilly. There's a little bit of a breeze. I don't love the fact that we're out here on the stern, bow, sure, starboard side, port. But I always love getting nautical with these episodes. And because the off season, especially early on in the off season, is a time in which there is so much change and there is so much to sort out. And it'll happen again, right? With the portal season happening after and during spring practice, there will be more to sort out. But
hey, sorry for the quick interruption, but it'd be incredible if you considered subscribing to the Solid Verbal YouTube channel right down below.
I think what becomes very en vogue, very popular, is to look at like winners and losers of the portal. Winners and losers of like the coaching hire season. This Jonathan Smith is an A. Yeah. Jeff Lebby's a B-. Like, okay, cool. Congratulations.
We went back and we looked at we won't name names, but some other rankings that had been given, some other grades that had been given, not just for this round, but for many of the previous rounds on the coaching carousel. And they're almost always wrong. Yeah. Very wrong.
Yeah. Look, and this is all to say, if we were to give grades, they'd be equally wrong.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
But it is like that trope where you're like, okay, I'm giving Kalen DeBoer at Washington in 2021 a C+. Okay, why? But like, it's one of those things where it's arbitrary, it's random, and it means very little because it's one person's sort of abstract opinion. A lot of it has to do with name recognition. Like Jonathan Smith at Michigan State is an A because look at what he did with Les at Oregon State. He'll have more resources. Like, okay, maybe. Maybe. What I want to talk about today, though, in the vein of our Twos Cruise universe, is not as much the like, as an authority giving a grade, giving a number, giving a whatever with a, Kalen DeBoer to Alabama, with Manny Diaz to Duke, what have you. I want to look at some ripples, some reverberations, some waves, some vacuums. Thank you very much, Ty.
You can multi-purpose that sound,
Of course. Fran Brown at Syracuse, right? Like, that has happened, okay? So instead of deciding on something that we have almost no data about, you can look at like early portal and recruiting returns and coaching hires, but it doesn't really mean that much. But what does it mean that Syracuse moved on from Dino Babers? What does it mean for the teams that Syracuse recruits against, Syracuse plays against? What does it mean for the ACC in terms of watchability? What is, holistically, what do these moves mean more in a more indirect way? To me, is almost as, if not more interesting than slapping a B- next to Fran Brown's name.
So case in point.
Yeah.
Case in point here, just as I think the most relevant example, this is the one that you and I discussed in Slack before we hit go. Nick Saban retires.
Yeah.
Nick Saban retires. We've talked a lot about the power vacuum that creates in college football, in the SEC, among the teams in the old SEC West. Clearly, him exiting means a lot for all the other teams that have driven themselves batty trying to compete with Alabama all these years.
Certainly.
That is an indirect benefit, let's say consequence in some way, shape, or form for other teams outside of Alabama. Mm-hmm. Yes? This is what we're going for with this.
Yes. Yeah. So let's start there. Let's start at the top. Let's start with the waves, the ripples, the indirect happenings based on there being not just a new coach at Alabama, but Nick Saban not being a college football coach in the SEC and at all.
Well, I mean, the most obvious thing I think, is we have grown accustomed to making Alabama. I mean, I certainly have. It was part of why I picked them in the playoff, right? We have grown very accustomed to penciling Alabama in as the winner of game against X.
Yeah, they're the standard.
They've been the standard bearer in college football
Right.
for, almost the entire duration that Saban's been there. The fact that he is gone, I think, for us as fans, and we can talk about programs and recruiting and all that, but just for us as fans, it means that we can't do that penciling in anymore. I think Kalen DeBoer is a great coach, but to your point from earlier, I don't know if we can. It feels like an A. It doesn't feel like they were going to do a whole lot better than Kalen DeBoer. It's hard to go up from Saban. So is Kalen DeBoer a good hire? Sure. It makes sense. I understand why they'd want to hire him. I do think, though, Nick Saban comes around once in a generation. There's a reason he's the greatest of all time. We're not going to be able to pencil in Alabama the way that we could before. And that, I think, is actually something that has real consequence for you and I, for college football fans as a whole, especially with so much else changing around college football.
Yeah.
We have grown so accustomed to Alabama just kind of being it all the time. The fact that they are not there right now creates a huge void, and also indirectly makes Alabama, I think, more interesting, right? Because
Sure.
How many times have you and I hit record on this show and gotten feedback from folks who are kind of tired of talking about Alabama? If you're an Alabama fan, that's probably not the case. But if you're a fan of anybody else, it did sort of become old hat. They were just always good.
Right.
They still, I'm sure, will be fine. But as a result, indirectly, Alabama becomes more interesting this fall, right? I don't think there's any two ways about it.
Yeah, look, in a couple of so you can think about it in a couple of different ways. Like Alabama became more and more interesting the more they won, not because of the results, but because what Nick Saban did was unprecedented. So they became more interesting, not in the like, oh, what do they look like in January? Are they winning another national championship? But you're like, how the hell did Nick Saban do this? How does he keep it going? How does he keep the energy up? How does he keep hiring new guys to fill out his coaching staff? How does he keep the energy up on the recruiting trail? Like, that's a fascinating thing.
Sure.
But it might be more fascinating to people like you and I than somebody at Tennessee who hates the adulation that Alabama continually gets because of Nick Saban and that program's, prolonged excellence. And so, yes, the reverberations are, the obvious recruiting ones that, the rich are going to continue to get possibly even by tiny little margins richer. Georgia, Ohio State, Texas A&M, LSU schools who are already recruiting at a super high level. And maybe, there are more national recruits than regional recruits that, a kid from the South might go to Notre Dame, might go to Michigan, might go to Oregon, might go to USC when he had previously he was only going to stay in the South if he got that Alabama offer, something like that. Florida State, Florida. So yes, the rich are going to get on the margins, maybe perhaps a little richer, but I think you'll still see a little bit of trickle on the recruiting trail that maybe a tier beneath, the top 10, top 15, that, we'll see recruits spread around a little more just based on the crazy consistent success that Alabama has had acquiring talent, both now in the portal and on the high school level and the portal level. So there's that. We talked about, like, there are hump teams here that, like, Lane Kiffin couldn't get over the Alabama hump. And now it's a 12-team playoff era, and a 10-2 Ole Miss will seemingly get into a 12-team playoff. But that road, at least in the short term, while we wait for Kalen DeBoer to fully build that roster and coaching staff and build that program to where he wants it to be, that the hump becomes less pronounced, the Alabama hump, right?
I think so.
And so
I think
which
that's fair.
teams fit that to you? Tennessee?
Probably.
Auburn?
Yeah.
LSU? Even Brian Kelly won in year one, but over time, it has not been necessarily a back and forth. And I would argue that the new entrance to the SEC, that the ongoing storyline and narrative with Texas and Oklahoma is like, well, yeah, you can win in the Big 12, but the SEC is a different story. Wait until you have week in, week out, Bama, LSU, Ole Miss. And now that list becomes a little less daunting when you're like, wait until you have Kalen DeBoer, Alabama, right? It's different for those types of teams. Well, the other element to Nick Saban, if I may, is I think it hurts college football because college football has a sort of name image likeness issue, I suppose. In that if you primarily like the NBA, if you're like, I'm a huge Raptors fan, but I like sports, and you realize that the national championship or the playoff is happening, and you're like, well, who's playing? And you're like, oh, that's Alabama, Michigan in the Rose Bowl. Cool. I'm going to root for Michigan because, screw Nick Saban, and, he's the evil empire. I'm going to root for Michigan. Like, Nick Saban was a great villain for the sport that Kirby Smart isn't. Dabo isn't, just because of like the mainstream name recognition that Nick Saban has and that nobody else in the sport on that level as a villain to root against to just generate mainstream interest. Like, not having Nick Saban, I think, hurts the sport. So the sport indirectly or directly is a loser on his retirement. I think Game Day is a winner. I think he'll be good on game day. I think like Julian Edelman's podcast might be a winner. Like, Nick Saban's just going to start appearing on a bunch of podcasts, right?
Right.
Nick Saban's going to like sit uncomfortably on Julian Edelman or like Travis Kelce's couch now, right? That's probably going to happen more often than not. So, good for everybody who has like an awkward Nick Saban on their couch, maybe including us. We'll see. I've got a couch straight to my left, Ty. I can make something work there.
Yeah.
And I guess good for Alabama boosters who wanted more power because they weren't necessarily having their voices heard in the Nick Saban era, because why would they? Anybody else with Nick Saban or Jeff Hafley or any well, let's stick with Saban. Any other indirect winners or losers?
The big one that comes to mind is obviously teams that were accustomed to playing against Saban. The fact that they don't have to do that now, I think, opens things up.
Yeah.
And whether you're playing against Alabama because you want to win or you're watching because you just want to see something interesting, I think everybody benefits from that. I agree with you. I think one of the knock-on effects from Saban retiring is that game day also becomes a little bit more interesting, right?
Sure.
You've got the greatest of all time now, who is good on camera, who will be on your television sets every Saturday morning in a capacity that allows him to speak freely, which he did a little bit previously, but we'll do a lot more of now. So I think we all win in that aspect. Beyond that, though, I think it's, I don't know, just like you said, losing the villain on the college football front definitely is a new dynamic that we're going to have to get used to.
Yeah. It was Belichick in the NFL, Saban in college. Yeah.
The sport works well when you've got someone to root against. My hunch is that'll shift to like Dabo or Kirby Smart or Ryan Day. Like, college football is never short on villains. We will find
it was
else.
Also Harbaugh too, I think.
Harbaugh. Yeah. I mean, should we talk about Harbaugh next?
Yeah. I'm trying to think. There was the only other thing about the Saban reverberations. A big winner will be the long-term fiscal prospects of the DeBoer family.
Oh,
I mean, the lake houses, the retirement plans, the realtors, like so many people are going to, because look, if it works out, he's going to be super rich. If it doesn't work out, he's probably going to be super rich. So a big indirect, or I guess more direct result is going to be the life-altering generational wealth of the DeBoer crest.
Before we get to Harbaugh, actually, this is one other one that I think is worth mentioning. It is clearly not as high impact, all right, as Nick Saban walking away from college football. Jeff Hafley walking away from Boston College to go to the NFL.
Okay.
Has had extreme knock-on effects that we did not see in the moment, right? What happened when Hafley left? When Hafley left, it was amid this ongoing conversation, this trend, this assumption that many folks in college football media and just college football fans made. And that assumption was, because the sport is changing, because NIL and the transfer portal, and because things are getting complicated, especially for a school like a BC or a Pitt or a NC State, I don't know. Coaches are going to walk away. Coaches are going to play the too old for this card. They're going to walk away.
Or they're going to
NFL.
reevaluate what a lateral move actually means. Yeah.
Air quotes. So Hafley leaves. That was all everybody talked about. What we didn't see in that moment is what could happen indirectly as a result. More directly, Bill O'Brien walked away from being the offensive coordinator.
Dominoes,
Ohio State, right? Walked away. He's going back to his hometown in Boston. He's excited to coach there. Did you see that it was a social media post of like all the white guys with gray hair watching Bill O'Brien give his like introductory? They were all the same guy.
Yeah.
But everybody's excited for Bill O'Brien coming back home. Okay. That's the first thing. The second thing is, all right, now there's a vacancy at Ohio State. Ohio State fills that vacancy with Chip freaking Kelly, which I think's a huge upgrade.
Yeah.
Over Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien's fine. I think given the personnel on hand, that is a huge benefit to Ohio State to go to Chip Kelly. And then, as a further knock-on effect, there is a vacancy at UCLA. They wanted to get rid of Chip anyway. There was no love lost there. I presume the only reason they didn't because they didn't want to pay the buyout money. And they instead now bring Deshaun Foster back. Former UCLA player, did a good job with the running backs, was headed to the NFL. They bring him back now to be the head coach of the UCLA Bruins starting this season. So one small move, Jeff Hafley leaving at Boston College, means Bill O'Brien goes to BC, means Chip Kelly goes to Ohio State, means Deshaun Foster goes back to the college ranks and ends up with the UCLA Bruins. Now, to what end are any of these going to be great moves? We know that Bruce was enamored with the Bill O'Brien move. Maybe I'm putting that a little too strongly. Bruce Feldman, who we had on the show, but he's intrigued by Bill O'Brien going back into the Boston market, a place where, no pun intended, Boston market, haha, but going back home and trying to build that program up. We know it's something Bill O'Brien's talked about extensively now. That's at least an intriguing move to bring him back. Chip Kelly obviously is going to be the headliner amid this series of dominoes just because of, Chip Kelly's pedigree as an offensive-minded coach, reuniting with Ryan Day, a guy that he knows pretty well. Deshaun Foster, we'll wait and see. I'm sure that there are some UCLA fans who are excited to bring Deshaun Foster back. I don't necessarily think that's an upgrade over Chip Kelly, but my hunch is that some folks in the UCLA community who had worn thin on Chip are just excited now to have some new blood in there. What all this looks like when the rubber meets the road in the 2024 season, we will have time to dissect that once we have more specifics on who's playing where. But in terms of things with direct and indirect waves, this is a pretty big one, and it's late in the cycle.
It's late in the cycle. So look, Boston College finishes 3-5 last year in the ACC, just ahead of Syracuse, Pitt, Virginia, and Wake, who were Wake finished 1-7 in the ACC. And so if you assume there are going to be more ACC wins to be had by Boston College having to make this move so late in the process and scrambling, and I don't have the transfer numbers at the moment, but it's going to be a new system. It's going to take time. By the way, did you see the September schedule of Boston College? Features a road game at Florida State and a road game at Mizzou, 2 of the first 3 weeks of the season. So an indirect result will be maybe some feisty Bill O'Brien pressers early on in the season.
Yes.
Syracuse, of course, making their own move to Fran Brown. And so there are reverberations, lower middle tier of the ACC. If you look at where the power structure was last season, it is Bill O'Brien's first taste of not being in the VIP section in quite some time, right? NFL, Penn State, Alabama, back to NFL, and now lower mid-tier ACC. And so it's different. It's definitely different, and he was obviously NFL before Penn State. And so that's an indirect result is going to be a taste of what Dabo calls it, the rest of y'all bus. That's going to be something new. Bill O'Brien was used to he was accustomed to a certain lifestyle. And so the reverberation is going to be Bill O'Brien. This is a direct one. Yeah.
Yeah. I am very curious on the Bill O'Brien front what this version of him now as a head coach looks like, because I remember when he was coaching at Penn State, he had established himself, at least among the media, as kind of like a no-nonsense guy.
Yeah.
And there was always this sentiment out there that Bill O'Brien probably would be better in the NFL. He doesn't have to recruit in the NFL. He doesn't have to worry about the glad handing and the politics that you need to do when you're interacting with boosters, as he did at Penn State. Now, that's not to say it's the same situation at Boston College as it is at Penn State. But he always felt to me, as a result of some of those conversations that I had with Penn State media folks at the time, like he would be better suited for the NFL. The NFL didn't really work out as a pro coach. He got plenty of run in Houston, but that was rocky the way it ended. I think as a coordinator, he's obviously established himself as a pretty smart guy. So I get the allure of Bill O'Brien as somebody running your offense, be it at the college or pro level. I'm just curious to see how he functions in this role on the rest of y'all's bus, and as somebody who is in charge of a program now. I'm sure he will get a rather long leash, given he's from the area and he's got the name recognition. And, he's somebody who I think is coming in at a good time for Boston College, because they were probably going to part ways with Jeff Hafley before long, just given the trajectory of that program. So it's a move that makes a lot of sense. Curious to see how it works out. A lot of folks have graded this one like an A and A minus. I get why you do that. I'm just not entirely sure that's going to work out long term.
You get an indirect because of Jeff Hafley leaving and the moves that came from it. You get the narrative of Chip Kelly in Autzen Stadium as offensive coordinator, just in the other booth than where he was last year, because Ohio State will be visiting Eugene this year. I think traffic to Pasadena will be significantly improved this year based on what I think UCLA is probably going to look like. UCLA finishes the year, I think, at USC in terms of conference games, but then they tacked on that Fresno game thereafter. If UCLA is bad, there might be 3,800 people in that stadium for the Fresno State game. There might be 3,800 people in that stadium. We could get an all-time ugly UCLA-Iowa game in the Rose Bowl. I just don't think UCLA is going to be much this year with that schedule, with the late shift. It's going to be tough. I think it frees up the schedule, like the New Year's-ish schedule of UCLA fans. Like maybe you'll be able to see some long-lost friends or family for the first time in a while. Your team not going bowling. You're going to be off the road. Something like that, Ty? No?
No.
Otherwise, where are we going next? You want to go?
Well, a point of intersect here is Jim Harbaugh.
Yes.
So Harbaugh finally makes the move. Harbaugh is going to be coaching the Chargers. Harbaugh has taken some of his staff members with him, notably Ben Herbert, strength coach, notably Jesse Minter, defensive coordinator. Sharon Moore has inherited that post for the Michigan Wolverines. He's still making some staff moves here and there, but by and large, that system is set up. Michigan had, I think, a league high 18 players invited to the combine.
Saw that.
Michigan will be a very different program next season. A lot of talent still in place. Defending national champion tends to have that. However, there will be a lot of turnover. Sharon Moore's work will be cut out for him. And I think by and large, it's tougher schedule, right? We talked about that before. Yep. Ohio State is doing everything it possibly can to try and load up. So let's talk about the indirect as a result of Jim Harbaugh walking away. What is the benefit around college football? What is the consequence around college football?
The benefit that college football has, there's going to be more Big Ten teams who are going to not necessarily win more games, but perhaps recruiting becomes a little bit easier. Not that Michigan was a recruiting power, but they recruited nationally. They went to the West Coast. They went to the East Coast. They went to the South. They did the whole Howard Dean thing. So recruiting might become a little bit more interesting. Certainly the Big Ten becomes less interesting without Jim Harbaugh. Like,
you think
Paul
it's
Feinbaum's going to need something new to talk about, in the middle of summer.
You think it makes them less interesting?
The Big Ten?
Yeah.
Without Jim Harbaugh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Why would the Big Ten become
Jim
more
Harbaugh,
interesting without Jim Harbaugh?
My point, I guess, is that after 3 years of having a bit of a stranglehold on the Big Ten, now suddenly it is is a bit of a void. And I think maybe it's something that is of more interest to us, perhaps, than the people who listen to us. But this version of Michigan now, without Harbaugh, with all those guys walking out the door, I mean, is it not a circumstance where we've got a vacuum up north like we do down south? Like, I kind of think it makes the SEC more interesting that Saban is gone. I kind of think it makes the Big Ten more interesting that Harbaugh is gone.
I don't think so. I think when you have a championship caliber program, it's always better when you have a big personality coaching a championship caliber program.
Okay.
I think the idea of Jim Harbaugh going 0 for whatever against Ohio State and then not only getting over the top, but doing it with a punctuated national championship, having like just a total weirdo atop a giant program is going to be much more interesting than Sherrone Moore running Michigan and hiring Wink Martindale or whatever. Like, it was peak interesting college football. We had a scandal and might still have a scandal. Who even knows? Like, it makes that scandal way less interesting, right? The Connor Stallions thing is way less interesting now that the coach has bolted for, no pun intended, the Los Angeles Chargers. So, no, I think the Big Ten is less interesting. You know, Ohio State has a better chance. Oregon has a better chance. Penn State has a better chance. But I don't know, having Jim Harbaugh as like the North Star of a conference, or Nick Saban being the North Star of a conference, like Michigan losing with Jim Harbaugh is more interesting than Michigan losing with Sherrone Moore. Nick Saban losing at Alabama is more interesting to me than Kalen DeBoer losing at Alabama, because we didn't see it all that often recently. And so, yeah, I think when you lose weirdos in a sport, you lose something beautiful. And, you know, having, you know, media members breathlessly report on Jim Harbaugh's milk or khakis or feelings on chicken, that's fine. I can do without that. But like, he generated so much weirdness himself that I'm going to miss it. I'm absolutely going to miss talking about Jim Harbaugh in this sport.
I think for me personally, Harbaugh had this identity as kind of a weirdo, as you said.
Yeah.
And there was a point for me, and I don't know if it was this season. I feel like it was at some point early last, when the weirdness stopped being kind of a punchline and something that we could hang our hat on and get a cheap laugh out of, and started being something that was extremely relatable. And it kind of made me like the guy a whole hell of a lot more. And, you know, like, of course, there were all these weird things. Where'd he go to, like, Quinn Nordin's house, and he slept over back in the day because he wanted to get the kicker recruit. And, you know, like, there were these things that we looked at and we said, man, this guy, I don't really want to be around this guy.
Well, he just had like this undeniable dad energy where you're just like, he's not committing to the bit. He is the bit. And
he is the bit. He is the bit. And the more I've seen, like the Excel interview that we talked about ad nauseum that he did with, I think, PMT, talking about how he uses Excel for everything. Like, there are some aspects of Jim Harbaugh that are so weird that they're intimately relatable, and I think do make it easier to root for the guy. Yeah. And for me, did last season. And
look, there are great reasons to root against him. There are great reasons to root against Jim Harbaugh. And to everybody who loved it, if you're a Penn State fan, Ohio State fan, whoever, it's less interesting, right? You'd much rather beat Michigan with Jim Harbaugh looking sad on the sideline than Sherrone Moore, right?
If you're an Ohio State fan, you'll beat him however you can. Doesn't matter who the coach is.
I understand, but I'm saying there's a degree of satisfaction that comes with Jim Harbaugh, Michigan losing. And so losing that has to be Ohio State wants to beat Michigan with Jim Harbaugh on the sideline. And
I think the indirect beneficiary of the Harbaugh move is probably a school like a Kansas. You know, when we had Bruce on maybe 2 times ago, he referenced this a little bit. But had this occurred earlier in the cycle, and I understand given the college football playoff and the way that the college calendar works versus the NFL calendar, the way that works, if Harbaugh was going to go back to the NFL, it was always going to be late in the cycle. But clearly, a school like a Kansas that has an obvious target like a Lance Leipold, they are probably jumping for joy and thrilled at the fact that the calendar worked out such that it just made much more sense to hire from within, which Sharon Moore is very capable and proved himself as such this season, as opposed to conducting a national search, as opposed to trying to go and get the best of the rest. Because I got to believe Lance Leipold would have been in that conversation. And given the way the calendar worked out, it just made more sense to hire Sharon Moore. It just did.
Yeah.
It made a ton more sense to hire from within. And so they bring Sharon Moore in. I think it'll be a continuation. I think it'll be fine, at least in the short term. We'll see what he can do long term. If you're a school like a Kansas, you're a school with really any up-and-coming coach or an up-and-coming name brand. Lance Leipold's been around a while. You feel, I think, pretty fortunate that it just sort of worked out the way it did.
I agree. I think competitively, you're right about where the Big Ten is. Like, it becomes more interesting that it seems that Michigan won't be in that conversation in year one, given not just Jim Harbaugh leaving, but the losses on that roster, especially on offense. But look, if you ask Tony Petitti, would he rather have Jim Harbaugh there or not for Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA joining up, Ohio State bringing back all these dudes, Penn State, still looking like they're going to be a very good team, making the changes they made on offense. Like, yeah, I think it makes the top of the Big Ten, like, take a step back, take 2 steps back.
What else, Dan?
In terms of reverberations, in terms of moves?
In terms of moves, reverberations, indirect, direct.
I think Kalen DeBoer leaving for Alabama and the void he left at Washington and the roster depletion that happened in Seattle.
So we're playing this one a little bit in reverse, right? We talked about Saban earlier and DeBoer coming in.
Right. Yeah. This isn't, I'm not connecting dominoes specifically with this, but this specific move had a ton of reverberations just because of teams able to add top tier Washington players. Ole Miss, I think, had a couple. Oregon added Jabbar Muhammad. Like, we had Will Rogers leave and then come back. So we had a lot of, offensive line guys, the receivers who are almost always going to leave for the NFL decided, definitely we're going to leave. We saw offensive skill talent. We saw guys on defense. Look, Dan Lanning has 0-3 against Kalen DeBoer. Huge winner. Now, the roster was always going to take a pretty deep step back without Michael Penix and those receivers and losing the offensive line talent, some key defensive players. But Kalen DeBoer with time to add guys in the portal. I think they added Jeremiah Hunter from Cal to be a new top tier receiver in that system. Like, they still would have been pretty dangerous with Will Rogers running Kalen DeBoer's system. I don't know if that's 9-3 dangerous, 8-4 dangerous, whatever. But those wins were going to come at the expense of some good teams, even if Washington themselves wasn't a playoff caliber team. And so Oregon is a huge beneficiary. Like, Kalen DeBoer being out of Dan Lanning's life in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And adding his best defensive player, arguably, in Jabbar Muhammad. I mean, Braylon Trice was incredible too. But is certainly the best player in that secondary to an Oregon secondary that had been beat up and kind of the reason they lost those Washington games with Michael Penix picking them apart. Like, a huge, huge beneficiary of Kalen DeBoer leaving. Also, the reverberations with Arizona and losing their coach to become the new head coach, Brent Brennan and Kenny Amadololo. Those are all your direct ripples, your direct, the wakes of those ships leaving in the middle of the night. I think the Big Ten move from Washington becomes less interesting without Kalen DeBoer. Like, as good as Jed Fish made Arizona in 3 years, like, Washington coming off of a playoff appearance, a 4-team playoff appearance, and going into a new conference and having to completely start over, I think some of the shine is off Big Ten expansion with Kalen DeBoer leaving and treating Washington the way that he did. I think that just, to me is an obvious, ripple effect of all of this. And coupling that with USC being down, UCLA losing their coach, like, I don't know. The expansion doesn't seem as explosive anymore to me.
All because of Kalen DeBoer.
All because of Kalen DeBoer leaving,
wow.
right? Because this is the complaint that so many people have with the sport, that the ability to move upward is blocked by the small handful of teams who recruit so well, and even in the portal recruit so well, and that Washington making this move, and Washington had been to the playoff before, but like as down as they were with Jimmy Lake, like they were a really, as much as it pains me to say, they were a feel-good story. They played exciting football that was fun to watch. They pulled out close games, and they became kind of this like new power.
Right.
And that can all go away so quickly in this era is a real bummer of an indirect result. I think it's bad for the sport that Washington can completely collapse the roster, the program status can completely collapse the way that it did in like a week and a half.
I don't want to draw any kind of assumptions here, because I said this a couple episodes ago and I had people email about it and send me tweets about it. And I get where they're coming from. I am very leery about this Jedd Fisch thing.
Yeah.
I'm very leery about Jedd Fisch. And I think he went on Ari's show and he tried to kind of quell things a little bit, because there is this sentiment out there that Jedd Fisch is not long for anywhere. And we spoke at length about it on an episode that we did when he was first hired. But if you've not been on social media lately, what's happening is folks are looking for content just as we are now, and they are focused perhaps on Florida's schedule this coming season. Florida's schedule is murder. It's one of the hardest in the country, maybe one of the hardest we've seen in a while, given where Florida is at. And we know that boosters, we know that Florida fans, just as a result, aren't too enamored with Billy Napier at the moment. Given Jedd Fisch's connection to Florida, he went to school at Florida specifically.
His student job,
specifically so he could work for Spurrier. He's a huge Florida fan. Florida people have certainly, in increasing numbers, had their eye on Jedd Fisch and what he was doing at Arizona, even before this move up to Washington.
Right.
Real quick, if you like the video, please consider subscribing to the full podcast at solidverbal.com, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. All the links are down below in the description.
And so, to your point of Kalen DeBoer leaves, creates a bit of a vacuum. There's a lot of roster turnover that we're going to see in 2024 and how that works out for Jedd Fisch. I do wonder if one of the indirect results of Kalen DeBoer leaving is not just the roster and as things stand in 2024 for Washington, but where it could stand in the wake of another departure.
Washington got in bed with a serial leaver.
They got in bed with a serial leaver.
All he does is leave places. Yeah.
They got in bed and again, I hate to draw that assumption because I've heard public comments from Jedd Fisch, and I think, at least what he said publicly has been fine.
Sure.
What's a guy going to say? I understand this is the business and this is the way things work. I also understand that there is a bit of a track record here. And so I just, I wonder if one of those things that we were talking about next year is not, oh, hey, look at Washington's roster now in the wake of one guy leaving, but how about I re-raise with two guys leaving in consecutive years?
Yeah.
I could see that happening, and, wouldn't be great for Big Ten expansion, at least not on the Washington side as they try to figure out who would be next. This is all like 6 moves ahead, 4-dimensional chess. I get it. But something that I've been thinking about a lot is if Washington has to go through this back-to-back years or, a couple moves in close succession. Oregon's had to deal with that.
Sure.
It takes a little bit to dig out from that and kind of chart a new course. So we'll see where things go. But that move has left Washington, and I think, a bit of uncertainty.
Yeah,
at least
well,
from
it
afar.
Certainly has left Arizona when you look at the reverberations, them hiring Brent Brennan. The direct result of the Brennan hire and the Fisch move is, a show of loyalty from Noah Fifita and T-Mac, which I think was great.
Yeah.
You are looking 4D chess here. You're looking years in advance, but what has come to define this sport right now is chaos and instability. And Jedd Fisch represents that. Represents the like job hopping, like what is it that fans crave right now? They crave dependability. They crave, loyalty. They crave, going back to the good old days. Some fans. I won't speak for all fans. But like when you listen to people talk about the sport, they talk about like, oh, we got to get the portal under control. We got to get NIL under control. The coaches are saying the same thing in a sport where coaches leave, players leave, teams leave conferences, right? Teams are left behind. Like, it's a mess. There's a lot about the sport that's a mess right now. And so when you have coaches who are either, staying loyal to their schools, Mike Norvell at Florida State or Sark at Texas, not taking that big job, I think the reverberation with their own fan base is really good because obviously, and this is foolish, but fans want coaches to like their school as much as they like their school. They want them to like Austin or Tallahassee or Eugene or whatever as much as, those fans like it. That's why you always see in press conferences like, how are you adjusting to Eugene? Does your family like Eugene? Does your family like Tallahassee? Whatever. And so when you have a coach who jumps around and you have a coach who takes a team to a playoff and immediately leaves after 2 years and doesn't recruit, it has I think a lasting effect on the sport when, like, how do you have enthusiasm right now if you're a Washington fan, right? Turning fans off after their team went to the playoff is not a great thing to do for the sport.
No.
And so I think that's going to have like lasting ripple effects here.
Yeah, and I mean the criticism you get whenever you try to play that 4D chess is, wow, I've gotten this before. This is a huge platform. You have thousands of people who listen, and reckless speculation is not gonna endear anyone to you. I'm not saying that Jedd Fisch is leaving for Florida. I'm saying there's plenty of rumors out there to suggest that he'd at least listen after year one at Washington, and boy, would that put them in a bit of a pickle.
Sure.
If it happened, if it came to that. Mike Elko, Dan. Yes. The Mike Elko hire at A&M, I mean, I think there's all sorts of repercussions for that move, both good and bad. If you're a Duke fan, I don't know how many Duke fans are out there listening to this show right now, but if you're a Duke fan, you hate to lose Mike Elko. On that same note, Manny Diaz, I think, is a pretty good replacement. I also think Manny Diaz being able to reel in Malik Murphy makes that program very interesting. And I liked Riley Leonard, and I like Duke under Mike Elko, but Malik Murphy, I think, is sort of a horse of a different color, man. I mean horse. That is a big freaking dude.
Yep.
That is a big dude playing quarterback who I think makes the Duke Blue Devils pretty damn interesting, at least on offense. So that keeps on rolling. If you're an A&M fan, I think there's all sorts of indirect results of Mike Elko stepping in, and direct. Things clearly had gone sideways with Jimbo Fisher, and it really felt like this is a guy who was unwilling to make necessary changes when maybe he saw the light.
In practice, he would make them in name, right? He would hire a new offensive coordinator, but
you make them in name.
The philosophy remained.
Right. And I feel like in the moments where he did try to change, it was a little bit too little too late. So now to bring in a guy like an Elko who seemingly is beloved by not just the players, but also those with the money, perhaps it can have some of that like unifying effect that you discussed with Texas. You discussed with, some other programs of Florida State, right? Coaches who are staying put and giving the fan base a reason to cheer. Mike Elko coming back home, so to speak, to College Station, I think is one of those things that can have a unifying effect with A&M. They've already got a lot of talent on hand, right? So he's got plenty to work with. But what they have lacked, I think, is that cohesion, that one guy who can bring it all together. And some of the early reporting on the Elko front, despite the fact that he had some guys leave, right? Evan Stewart, Walter Nolan, these guys went elsewhere. It still seems like the guys who are around like Elko a great deal and feel really good about what he is trying to do in short order in College Station.
Yeah, so are we approaching this from the Elko leaving Duke or from the Elko arriving at Texas A&M? those
I mean,
reverberations.
I think we have to look at it on both fronts. You know, the easiest is probably to talk about Elko arriving at A&M and what that means around the SEC. I mean, I think it makes A&M more credible
Okay.
in the short term. I think we had started looking at Jimbo Fisher as a bit of a punchline
Of course.
because of the contract, right? Because it was a 7-5 team, because he just could not get them over the hump. Elko stepping in, given what he did in short order at Duke, I think gives them a ton more credibility. It feels like it's a more serious program to me.
Yeah, I think on the face, what does a more stable Texas A&M look like? What does a more, with post Sumlin, post Jimbo, there is this idea that Texas A&M has a grown up in a way that they haven't in quite some time in Mike Elko, who seems sort of universally liked as a person, universally liked as somebody who can develop a roster, who can hire well, bring in Holman Wiggins from Alabama, Colin Klein from Kansas State, Jay Bateman I'm not super high on, but it's going to be a Mike Elko defense. So what does that mean? What does a more stable, professionalized, adult Texas A&M mean? Well, we know that talent acquisition shouldn't be a problem. We know that NIL shouldn't be a problem. So the question is, what can he do on the recruiting front and the development front to challenge who right now? Like Texas for recruits, LSU for recruits, Alabama for recruits, Ole Miss for recruits. Like, I think the roster will be there. So what does it mean if Texas A&M can go from being an 8-win program to a 10-win program consistently? The SEC becomes way more interesting. Like, if you have interesting, huge games at Kyle Field, that's a huge win for the conference. That's an unbelievable environment. Weird, yes, but still a great environment for the SEC, an SEC that is sort of coming into a new era where the standard goes from being Alabama and Georgia to just Georgia at the moment. I think the LSU quote-unquote rivalry at the end of the season can become spicier, and that's weird to say given the 7 overtime game that ended in fisticuffs a couple of years ago. But I think we could have an ongoing back and forth there that's more interesting, and we get to see if the promise of Texas A&M finally turning a corner after 150 years can finally happen. This is all great. These are all great things for the SEC and for Texas A&M if it comes to pass. So, yeah, I don't think it's crazy pronounced. They've never had that problem recruiting, and so I don't think somebody's going to step in and take a bunch of Texas A&M recruits or anything like that. But I think just the idea of tuning into a Texas A&M game and having a better idea of what to expect, I think it's a good win for college football fans.
Week 1 against Notre Dame.
Where is that game?
College Station.
It's in College Station. Great.
It's like the game of week 1. Notre Dame against Texas A&M.
Great. And it's in a college stadium, even better.
And it's in a college stadium, even better. The ramifications, I think, on the Duke side are interesting. Losing Elko sucks if you're
I just don't think you can ask for more than Mike Elko and what he
I don't think you can ask
Duke.
for more than Mike Elko. And I think, Manny Diaz will be fine. Manny Diaz has coached in the conference before. Manny Diaz is proven he's now able to reel in a pretty big fish in the transfer portal.
Yeah.
The ACC as a whole is kind of in a weird place. And I don't know if the indirect result of Elko leaving means a whole lot for the conference, but
I think it's good for Dabo.
I think it's good for Dabo.
These are programs that have either beaten or put the fear of life into the better or even the more mediocre of Clemson programs. Duke, Boston College, Syracuse, all these new coaches and all the changes and roster upheaval. Again, if stability is the new secret sauce, Clemson certainly has that in Dabo Swinney, and having those types of upstart programs have to kind of start over, it probably means fewer 8-4 seasons. Still probably 10-2 for Clemson, but it's nicer for him, I think.
Which are the ACC programs to you that have the most stability in this new world order. I mean, Florida State, obviously.
Yeah.
Clemson has stability to some extent.
For better or worse. Yeah.
Louisville is building it. It's probably too early to say that they have it, but it seems as if Jeff Brom's doing a pretty good job building it quickly via the portal through other means.
I mean, it's NC State is a stable program, even though quarterback upheaval has been pretty pronounced these past couple years. But the baseline of, keeping Tony Gibson around, having a at worst interesting defense, at best pretty suffocating. I think NC State's a really stable program.
NC State's stable. North Carolina is stable.
Perhaps a lot of changes recently, but yeah.
But otherwise, there just aren't a whole lot. So yeah, if you're another team, particularly like Clemson in the ACC,
right,
losing some stability elsewhere in the conference benefits you.
I agree. Right, Syracuse, for better or worse, I wouldn't say they were stable because it was sort of like under Dino Babers. It was, 1 year the offense is really, really interesting and good with Eric Dungy or whoever, and then the next year it's the defense leading the way with Tony White. Right. So I wouldn't say stable, but Dino Babers being there as long as he was, cycling in and out of offensive coordinators, it sort of became the instability was the stability at Syracuse. But, he would throw kitchen sinks at people, and that's great. And so now we get Syracuse starting over, Boston College starting over, Duke starting over, and they represented, I think, the feisty middle class of the ACC for a good long time.
Anything else, Dan, here?
In terms of coaching reverberations and power vacuums, which other new coaches do you have?
I mean, you've mentioned Fran Brown a great deal.
Yeah.
One name we haven't talked a whole lot about is Jonathan Smith. We mentioned at the top. Obviously one of the Oregon State gets the short end of the stick, not just with this, but with
everything. Yeah,
pretty much everything, right? And that's a direct short end of the stick. We don't have to beat around the bush. Everyone understands that one. Jonathan Smith, though, coming to East Lansing, of course, takes over from Mel Tucker. That situation was a mess. This season, he steps in, he brings pretty big name quarterback with him.
Aiden Childs,
and, we haven't seen a whole lot of Aiden Childs. Like, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but certainly he's one of those names that is a mover and a shaker as it relates to other names in the portal. So to bring him along to East Lansing, I think is significant. And I don't know what the program looks like in the near term, but I know that we've come to trust Jonathan Smith a fair amount. So that, to me, the reverberations from that move, I think, coupled with Sharon Moore taking over at Michigan, the state of Michigan college football right now is in a very, very interesting spot. We've got one team that's been there for a couple of years now. We've got another that is trying to get back there. And that, to me, I don't know if I fully have the words for it.
Okay.
Is one of the more interesting dynamics that I am looking forward to this season.
Okay. Yeah. So what does it mean for Jonathan Smith to be at Michigan State? That he is not a huge personality, but just sort of puts his head down, develops really strong, interesting offenses, hires really well. Oregon State became a really interesting transfer destination on the West Coast, and Michigan State has become that transfer destination. Mel Tucker had turned it into that, but just without a ton of success outside of the best transfer perhaps of the portal era in Wake Forest, Kenneth Walker.
Walker, yeah.
I don't think a lot changes in that regard. I think it's still Michigan State is still, at least for these first couple of years, is going to heavily rely on the portal as Jonathan Smith and his staff is introducing itself to the Midwest. So I don't think there's a lot of reverberation there. I think there is that vacuum, like you mentioned, with Michigan, at least somewhat. I think the Wolverines are still in a much more advantageous position in the short term than Michigan State is, even though Jonathan Smith has a lot more head coaching experience than Sharon Moore. I honestly don't see a lot of reverberations for Michigan State. because of the way Oregon State was left out in realignment, that
That's
it
the
almost left him no choice but
Yeah.
to look externally. And look, you can say he was, looking at this job or looking at, getting out before the season was over, and that's why they lost to Oregon, whatever. But the reverberation, like, it just wasn't fair to look at what he had accomplished and where his name was, where his stock was, and say he should stick with Oregon State as they go through this. Like, that just, I don't know if that's necessarily based in reality. So Oregon State, obviously their roster has collapsed. Their best players have transferred all over the place, most notably DJU to Florida State, if I remember correctly.
That is correct, yeah.
But Michigan State and Jonathan Smith will now have this reputation as a good destination, a stable destination, which I don't think has been the case for Michigan State these past few years, despite the killer 2020 was the year, the Kenneth Walker season.
Right.
So what does it mean for the Big Ten to have a more stable Michigan State? It can only be positivity. It can only be positive. That's good for the Big Ten. It's good for in-state Michigan talent, and keeping it's a pretty with the Detroit metro area and Cass Tech, it's really good for in-state kids to stay home. But I still don't think Michigan State really elevates to a headliner within the conference in the short term. So I don't think a lot changes. I think Michigan State is one of those jobs that you're not going to be able to lift a profile a ton unless, you do find that quarterback, you do find, a dynamic offense in East Lansing. So I'm not there with Michigan State in terms of it having huge ripple effect within the sport and hiring Jonathan Smith, but that just might be because of his personality and that, Corvallis is not exactly the center of the universe.
All right. Solidverbal@gmail.com. Write in. Let us know your thoughts.
Yes.
Reverberations.
Ripples. Dominoes.
Ripples.
Yeah.
Dominoes after this round on the coaching carousel. As we're out here in the high seas, Dan, you can also go on out to verballers.com, VERBALLERS.com. That's our Patreon. Listen ad-free, get bonus episodes, get access to a whole variety of our off-season perks.
Yeah.
Also out in social media, give us a holler. Let us know your thoughts on everything we discussed here today. Certainly would welcome your feedback. Also, if you are a public listener, we will be, maybe on the next episode, giving out a URL for folks to take a little survey, help us out as we try to craft our off-season agenda here, Dan.
Yeah. It actually, this episode may have been more of an example of what didn't happen. Like, there won't be a new coach at Oregon. There won't be a new coach at Texas. There won't be a new coach at Kansas. There won't be a new coach at Florida State. Like, it's kind of an example, like, not a new coach at Iowa, despite, perhaps a lot of people thinking that it was time for a change in philosophy. And
I'm one of them, but sure.
That Florida, right? That coaches not leaving for the Alabama job, not leaving for the Michigan job, not leaving for the Washington job or whatever. Like, it almost is a study in potential energy instead of kinetic energy, if I'm using that correctly. That it was the reverberations of all of those schools keeping their coaches, I think, brings a ton of positive energy into the 2024 season.
All right, you know how to find us, folks. Give us a holler. Let us know your thoughts on today's episode. We'll be back a little later on in the week. In the meantime, for my first mate, Dan Rubenstein, for myself, your Captain Ty Hildebrandt, we will talk to y'all soon. Stay solid.
Peace.